The metal door let out a sharp creak as Aller Whitley pushed it open, the sound slicing to the cold stillness like a distant memory. The strong scent of disinfectant mixed with wet fur hit him immediately, stirring something deep in his chest. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast pale reflections on the stained tile walls, making the place feel more like a forgotten ward than an animal shelter. He paused at the threshold for a moment. He thought about turning back, but something unseen pulled him forward. Something he couldn't yet explain. At 63, Aller moved like a man carrying decades of weight, memories, regrets, and silence. After losing Beatrix 3 winters ago, the cabin he once called home had grown unbearably quiet. The fireplace crackled. The radio mumbled in the background, but none of it filled the space she left behind. That morning, he turned on the radio as he always did and heard a voice say, "Give a second chance to a forgotten friend. West Grove Shelter is waiting." He didn't know why those words hit so hard, but within the hour, he was in his truck heading to town. Most of the dogs barked as he walked by, eager tails thumping against kennel doors. Some whined. Others jumped, all vying for attention. Aller nodded to a few, but kept moving. Then, at the far end of the hallway, in a dimly lit, rusted enclosure, he stopped. There stood a German shepherd, silent, unmoving, watchful. Their eyes met. No barking, no growling, just a steady gaze that seemed far too knowing. Aller crouched, and the dog took a slow step forward with deliberate calm. The shepherd lifted one paw and placed it gently in the man's hand. A young woman from the shelter appeared behind him. "That's Boone," she said softly. "Came in 4 months ago. He was a service dog. His handler was military, like you. We haven't been able to track any next of kin." Aller didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on Boone. Something unspoken passed between them. Something ancient and raw. The way the dog looked at him. It wasn't just trust. It was recognition. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. The staff opened the gate and let him sit inside. Boone didn't hesitate. He walked over and rested his head gently on Aller's knee, letting out a deep, tired sigh. Aller's hand moved instinctively, running through Boone's thick fur. It felt like a connection that had been waiting to happen. When the adoption paperwork was brought in, the woman said, "He doesn't act like this with anyone. It's like he's been waiting for you." Aller said nothing. He took the pen, signed his name, and Boone never left his side after that. As they stepped outside together into the biting wind, something gnawed at the back of Aller's mind. There was something haunting in Boone's eyes, something familiar, a weight, a memory, a shadow he couldn't quite place. But he would. He knew it deep in his bones. And when the truth finally came, it would unravel everything he thought he knew. If this part already moved you, just wait for what's coming next. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. We're on the road to 100,000 subscribers, and every click helps the story reach more hearts. Don't go anywhere. The best is yet to come. The drive back to the cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. Boone sat in the passenger seat without shifting once, eyes forward, ears perked like a soldier returning from a mission. Aller glanced at him every few miles, unsettled by the dog's stillness. It wasn't just calm, it was focus. Boone didn't look at the passing trees, didn't sniff at the cracked window. He simply stared ahead, as if he already knew exactly where they were going. And in some strange way, that made Aller uneasy. The cabin sat at the edge of a wooded hill, half swallowed by pine and memory. When they stepped inside, Boone moved with slow purpose, sniffing the floorboards and pausing in the living room beneath the mantel. His eyes locked on a photograph above the fireplace. Aller and Beatrix, smiling in the faded warmth of a summer long gone. Boone sat down and stared at it, unmoving. Aller stood beside him, gripping the back of a chair. "You're not the only one who misses her," he said quietly, not expecting a response, but somehow feeling like Boone understood. That night, Aller laid out an old quilt by the hearth, expecting Boone to settle there. Instead, the dog followed him into the bedroom and curled up beside the nightstand where Beatrix used to keep her books and her tea. Aller lay awake longer than usual, the ceiling above him feeling closer than ever. Boone didn't fidget or stir, just lay there, breathing slow and steady. It was the kind of presence that filled a room without sound, the kind that reminded him of her. As the days passed, a quiet routine took shape. Mornings on the porch, Aller with his coffee, Boone by his feet, watching the tree line like he was waiting for something or someone. He was obedient, gentle, but strange in a way he reacted to certain sounds. The creak of the front door, the tone of an old wind chime, even the ticking of Beatrix's antique clock. Each made Boone pause, ears alert, as if the past had whispered to him in a language only he understood. On the fourth night, Aller found himself in the attic. It wasn't planned. Something just drew him there. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled like time. Boone followed, but stopped just short of the top step. Aller opened a box marked personal. Inside, he found letters, photos, and one old leather-bound journal. When he picked it up, Boone froze. A low, sharp whimper escaped from him, more memory than fear. Aller sat down, his heart beginning to beat faster. The journal was in Beatrix's handwriting, but it wasn't poetry or reflections. It was organized, clinical, dates, name, coordinates, most crossed out. The last entry read, July 4th. We found him. He doesn't remember yet. Aller felt a chill run through him. Boone approached and rested his head on Aller's knee, eyes wide, breathing steady. It was the same gesture from the shelter, but now it carried weight. Boone wasn't just here for company. He was part of something, and whatever it was, had already begun to surface. The journal didn't leave Aller's side for the next 2 days. He read and reread the entries until the ink blurred in his eyes. There were names he didn't recognize, some scribbled out so forcefully the paper tore. There were dates tied to locations he'd long forgotten, a base in Nevada, a hospital in Maryland, a research facility in Utah. But none of it made sense. Why would Beatrix have this? She was a literature professor. She taught poetry and Faulkner at night. None of this fit, unless there was a side of her he never truly knew. Boone stayed closer than ever. His behavior shifted, more alert, more watchful. He followed Aller from room to room, ears turning at every creak and whisper in the house. Aller tried to ignore the growing unease that wrapped around his chest, but it became harder to dismiss when Boone began reacting to specific phrases. Every time Aller read aloud from the journal, the dog would react. When he said the word Delta, Boone would sit up straight, eyes fixed on him. At the mention of lockage, the dog would growl softly, not in aggression, but like he was remembering something too. One evening, Aller found an old voice recorder tucked inside a tin box beneath Beatrix's winter scarves. The label read simply, June 12th, don't erase. His hands shook as he pressed play. First, just static, then her voice came through, soft but steady. If you found this, Aller, it means something. Something's begun. She sounded calm, resigned. There are things I couldn't tell you when I was alive. Things I promised to keep buried. But Boone remembers. He's the last piece of it. The recording cut off. That was all. Aller sat for nearly an hour in complete silence. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the funeral. But something cracked quietly inside him. Boone walked over, rested his head on Aller's boot, and looked up with those dark, knowing eyes. There was no doubt left now. The dog had belonged to her in ways Aller never understood, and whatever secret Beatrix had carried to her grave, Boone had carried through time. The next morning, Aller drove into town and visited the local archives. He asked for any records related to lockage. The clerk frowned, typed quietly, and said, "We don't have anything under that name in the public system." But when he mentioned it again in passing to an older war buddy at the hardware store later that afternoon, the man's expression darkened. "Lockage," he muttered. "That wasn't a place. That was a project." Then he dropped his voice lower. "You sure you want to go digging there, Al?" That night, Aller couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside the cabin, and Boone paced near the door like he was guarding something only he could sense. The journal, the tape, the name Lockage, it all swirled in Aller's mind like a storm forming just over the horizon. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just about Beatrix's past. It was about his own. Something she had protected him from. Something Boone had returned to help him face. Aller hadn't heard the name Lockage in over 30 years. Not since the night He signed a confidentiality agreement under fluorescent lights in a facility with no windows. Back then, it was just another assignment. He had been a younger man, still sharp, still able to sleep through the night. But now, sitting at his kitchen table, journal open, Boone by his side, it felt like that word had claws. It dragged him back to a time he had done everything to forget. That night, Aller poured himself a glass of bourbon for the first time in months. He sat on the porch, Boone lying silently at his feet, watching the trees sway in the wind like they were whispering secrets. Aller closed his eyes and let the memories come. Lockage hadn't been a place. It was a psychological operations unit, classified, experimental. Their mission wasn't combat. It was memory manipulation, erasure, control. He had been a part of it. And so had Beatrix, apparently. He remembered vague details. Patients, soldiers with broken minds, words that triggered panic or calm, dogs trained to detect reactions before they were conscious. Boone! Could he have been part of that? Was he one of the animals trained to recognize something hidden deep inside the mind? The idea sounded far-fetched until he looked down and saw Boone staring at him again. Not like a pet, but like a partner waiting for a signal. The next day, Aller opened a locked trunk in the attic he hadn't touched in over 2 decades. Inside were medals, old uniforms, and a sealed envelope with no return address. He didn't remember placing it there. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed no signature, just a line. If he starts to remember, follow Boone. He'll take you to the rest. That was it. No explanation, no sender. But Boone, standing just a few feet away, suddenly barked once, sharp, clear, then turned and walked toward the back door. Aller followed, unsure what to expect. Boone led him not into the woods, but to the edge of the old shed behind the cabin. The structure was falling apart, overtaken by vines, forgotten. Boone scratched at a loose board near the foundation, then stepped back. Aller knelt, pulled the board loose, and found a metal box buried beneath the dirt. Inside, a flash drive, a locket with Beatrix's photo, and another journal. This one wasn't hers. It was his handwriting. Pages of entries he didn't remember writing. He sat there in the dirt, heart racing, while Boone stood watch. Each entry on the pages detailed missions, sessions, names of people Aller didn't recognize but apparently once did. He flipped to the last page. They told me to forget, and I did. But Beatrix didn't. She saved Boone because she knew the day would come when I'd need to remember. Aller looked up, tears burning behind his eyes. "What did you do, Beatrix?" he whispered. And for the first time since she died, he felt her absence like a fresh wound. Aller stayed up until dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with the second journal open in front of him. Each entry peeled back another layer of a life he didn't know he'd lived. His own handwriting stared back at him, painfully familiar yet entirely foreign. There were descriptions of procedures, psychological trials, and phrases like response conditioning and cognitive suppression. But one name kept repeating in the margins, always underlined, always circled. Boone. He stared across the room at the dog, who now slept near the cold fireplace, tail curled tightly, breathing steady. Boone had never needed to be trained, not in the traditional sense. He already knew the rhythms of the house, the energy of the rooms, and now Aller understood why they had once worked together. He didn't remember it, but Boone clearly did. Whatever bond they had formed in that lost time, it had been stronger than science had predicted, stronger than memory itself. It was then that Aller noticed something tucked in the back of the journal. A photograph, old, discolored edges frayed. It was him, much younger, standing in a concrete room next to Beatrix. Both of them were wearing white coats. Between them sat Boone, smaller, but unmistakably the same dog. Aller's breath caught in his throat. Beatrix had always told him she never visited his work, never wanted to be part of that world. But here she was, in the heart of it, smiling calm as if she belonged. The betrayal stung, not just for the lies, but for the realization that she had lived a double life just like he had, except she remembered hers, and she had chosen not to tell him. Had it been to protect him, or to protect herself? He couldn't tell. But the more he thought about it, the more he understood the burden she must have carried. and the more he feared what else she kept hidden. He pressed play on the old voice recorder again, hoping to catch something new. This time, after her initial message, a second voice clicked on, distorted. He's waking up. If he find the others, it's over. Boone's ears perked up immediately. He stood alert, eyes locked on Aller like he was waiting for him to move. The dog took 3 slow steps toward the door and looked back. Aller stood, heart pounding, body tense. "Where are we going?" he asked out loud, knowing full well Boone couldn't answer in words. But the dog turned the knob with his snout, something he had never done before, and waited. That wasn't training. That was memory. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sky was dark with clouds, and the trees shifted like they too were holding secrets. Boone led him not toward the woods, but toward the old back road behind the property. It had been closed off for years, overgrown, forgotten. Aller followed without hesitation. Something was out there, something Beatrix never meant for him to find until now. What if your memories were hiding truths that could change everything? Would you trust your instincts or the dog? Tell me in the comments what you think Boone is leading Aller to discover. The dirt road behind the cabin hadn't been used in years. Tree limbs arched overhead like ribs, and weeds reached waist-high in places. Aller stepped carefully, the sound of snapping twigs underfoot, the only thing filling the silence, until he realized Boone wasn't just leading him blindly. The dog paused at specific spots along the path, sniffed the ground, then looked back as if to confirm Aller was still following. This wasn't instinct. This was a trail, one they had walked before. Half a mile in, they reached a break in the trees where an old wooden post stuck out from the brush. Nailed to it was a rusted piece of metal, barely legible, but Aller recognized a faded engraving. Sector C, access restricted. His stomach turned. He remembered hearing that name in passing during lockage briefings. They said it had been shut down, erased from the maps, buried. But Beatrix had found it, and somehow, so had Boone. They walked further until the path gave way to cracked concrete, half devoured by roots and moss. At the end of the clearing sat a bunker-like structure, almost invisible beneath the earth. Its door was metal, rusted shut. Boone scratched at it, then sat back, waiting. Aller hesitated, eyes scanning the overgrown surroundings. His heart thudded against his chest. If what was inside had been hidden this long, maybe it was meant to stay that way. But his hand moved anyway. He reached for the handle, pulled, and to his surprise, it gave. Inside, the air was thick with damp rot and something else. Antiseptic, faint but persistent. A few old lights flickered dimly from solar backups. The hallway ahead was narrow, lined with broken clipboards, shattered glass, and papers that had melted into floor from water damage. Boone didn't hesitate. He led the way, tail low, every step deliberate. Aller moved slowly behind him, recognizing the layout as if in a dream. This place wasn't unfamiliar. He had been here many times. They reached a door marked Observation Room 2. Boone stopped, growled low, not from fear, but from warning. Aller pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, lined with recording equipment, now mostly dead, but in the center sat a desk and a box labeled simply Whitley. His breath caught. He opened it. Inside were tapes, files, photographs of him younger, sitting with Boone, sitting with Beatrix. Notes scribbled in her handwriting. Subject regressing. Refuses to recall Incident 7. Memory tethered to dog. Aller stumbled back, gripping the edge of the desk. Boone stepped beside him and rested his head against Aller's leg. In that moment, something inside Aller gave way, like a door in his own mind creaking open. Images came, fragments. A room filled with screaming, a command he didn't want to give, Boone barking, Beatrix crying, then darkness. He dropped to his knees, breath shallow. Boone let out a soft whimper, pressing closer. Whatever had been locked away inside him was waking up. The first flash came like a lightning strike, sharp, blinding, and gone in an instant. Aller staggered back from the desk, clutching his head as images flickered behind his eyes. Men in uniforms, eyes glazed over, voices repeating phrases in monotone. Boone barking, restrained. Beatrix standing behind a two-way mirror, not as a visitor, but as an observer. He had always believed she kept her distance from his military life, but now he saw her clearly, in a lab coat, writing notes, eyes full of something between fear and resolve. He sank to the floor, hands trembling. Boone pressed against him like a stabilizing weight. The files had told the truth. He was a subject, not a soldier running the experiment, but part of it. Boone hadn't just worked beside him. Boone was assigned to him, trained to track changes in his psychological state, to alert Beatrix if the suppression began to fail. Aller had been part of a test, one that went too far, one they tried to bury, and she had helped them until eventually she didn't. A new memory surfaced. He remembered Beatrix arguing, her voice sharp, desperate. You can't erase what's human, not like this. Then him, strapped to a chair, a white light above. Boone barking nonstop until someone dragged him from the room. The pain, the silence, then nothing. He had never been the same afterward. That was when the headache started, the gaps. Beatrix said it was stress, age, grief. But now he knew she had helped take parts of him away and then spent the rest of her life trying to give them back. The realization hollowed him. He stood slowly, his legs weak, his throat dry. Boone didn't look away, didn't flinch. There was no blame in the dog's eyes, only patience, loyalty. The same unwavering presence he had shown since the day they reunited. Boone had waited years for Aller to find this place, this truth. He had protected the pieces until Aller was ready to hold them again. And now they were here, both of them broken but not lost. In the far corner of the room, Aller noticed a cabinet, half covered in debris. Inside it, a locked drawer. He found a key taped beneath the desk, as if someone had left it there just for him. The drawer creaked open to reveal one last tape, labeled in Beatrix's handwriting. Final session for Aller. He turned to Boone. You knew about this? He said softly. Boone sat, eyes steady, as if giving him permission to listen. With shaking hands, Aller picked up the tape and slid it into the still working recorder. Beatrix's voice filled the room. Cal, direct Aller. If you're hearing this, then your memory has begun to return. I fought them. I swear to you, I tried to stop it, but I couldn't, so I stayed close. I kept Boone safe, and I waited. I always believed you'd find your way back. Her voice cracked just once. You were more than the subject. You were the man I loved, and what they took from you wasn't just data. It was your soul. I tried to say what I could. Her words faded into static, but Aller sat frozen, the tape still running, with Boone beside him in the dark. The bunker felt colder after the tape ended. Aller sat motionless in the flickering light, the words of Beatrix looping in his mind like a haunting lullaby. What they took from you wasn't just data. It was your soul. He hadn't cried in years, but something broke loose now. Not loudly, not violently, just a quiet stream of grief, the kind that seeps out. When there's nothing left to hold it back, Boone didn't move. He simply sat beside him, watching, waiting like he had done so many times before. It wasn't just about memory anymore. It was about identity, about the life he had lived without consent. Aller realized now that the man he had been, the soldier, the husband, the friend, had been fractured, carefully edited, and handed back to him like a script. And Beatrix, in her guilt and love, had spent the rest of her life trying to piece him together without breaking him again. She hadn't betrayed him. She had carried him, protected him from the very truth she helped create. He stayed in the bunker until nightfall, going through every document, every photograph, every trace of the person he used to be. It was overwhelming, but it was also strangely grounding. For the first time in years, he felt present in his own skin. He wasn't just remembering. He was reclaiming. Boone let him out only when the air grew too heavy to breathe. Outside, the stars had begun to blink into view, and the wind had settled. The night felt still, like the world had paused to let him catch up. Back at the cabin, Aller placed a final journal and the tape recorder beside Beatrix's photograph on the mantel. He lit the fireplace and sat with Boone at his side, the orange glow dancing across the wooden walls. There was peace in the silence now, one that didn't come from forgetting but from understanding. He wasn't sure what came next. Maybe he'd reach out to others from Lockage, if they were still alive. Maybe he wouldn't. But he knew one thing. The man he used to be was still inside him, And now, finally, he could look him in the eye. As Boone rested his head on Oller's foot, the older man reached down, fingers brushing to the thick fur. "You stayed," he whispered, "even when I didn't know who I was." Boone's tail thumped once against the floor. A small sound, but it echoed louder than anything else. That night, a week had passed since Oller unearthed the truth. The days were quieter now, different. He still woke before sunrise, still brewed his coffee the same way. But the silence in the cabin no longer felt hollow. It felt intentional. Boone remained close as always, moving with an unspoken rhythm that now made perfect sense. They had once been connected through wires and commands. Now they were bound by something stronger, memory rediscovered and trust rebuilt. Oller spent most of his time organizing the documents and recordings from the bunker. Some he burned, details too dangerous to leave behind. Others he archived, not out of paranoia, but preservation. He knew he wasn't the only one who had gone through lockage. There had been others, soldiers, test subjects, dogs like Boone, long forgotten. In the bottom of the last folder, paper brittle with age, he found one final document labeled Whitley Contingency. It was a letter, signed but written in Beatrix's handwriting. "If you ever recover everything," it began, "you'll have a choice to make. Walk away and let it stay buried, or find them, the others. Some might remember pieces. Some remember nothing at all, but they deserve the truth too." Oller felt a slow, familiar ache in his chest. Beatrix hadn't just left him breadcrumbs to his own past. She had left him a mission, one last task. The kind of quiet redemption only someone who loved deeply could ever plan. He stared at the map she'd drawn on the back of the page. It marked 3 towns scattered across state lines. Next to each one, just a name. No rank, no title, just names handwritten in soft, slanted ink. Evans Delgado roar. The sight of the name stirred something inside him, not recognition, but responsibility. Boone looked up at him from across the room, tail twitching gently, waiting for a word, a signal, like he used to. Oller folded the map slowly, carefully, and placed it inside his jacket. "I think she always knew I wouldn't be able to leave it alone," he said out loud. Boone walked over, sat beside him, and nudged the jacket with his nose. "You ready to go back out there, old friend?" Oller asked, a tired smile tugging at his lips. Boone didn't move, but his eyes said everything. The past had finally caught up to them, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't finished yet. The truck engine rumbled to life just after sunrise. The sky was streaked with soft golden gray, the kind of morning Beatrix used to say felt half dream, half awake. Oller slid the folded map into the glove box, placed the last journal in the passenger seat, and gave Boone a gentle pat before the dog climbed in beside him. There was no ceremony, no final glance back at the cabin. He wasn't running from anything. He was answering something that had waited too long. The miles passed like old songs, familiar but faded. Each town marked on the map brought with it quiet tension. Oller didn't know what he'd find. Maybe the names were gone. Maybe the people had moved on. But that wasn't the point. It was about showing up, about honoring what Beatrix had tried to do in secret, to restore what had been taken one truth at a time. Boone watched the road with the same stillness he always had, but every so often he'd glance at Oller, as if reassuring him they were on the right path. In Evans, he found men in his 70s who were recurring dreams of things he didn't understand. Faces, codes, a German shepherd barking in the dark. In Delgado, a quiet woman ran a roadside antique shop, and when Oller said the word lockage, she froze for a full minute before whispering, "I thought I made that up." These people didn't want answers. They wanted peace. And somehow, just speaking with Oller, knowing someone else remembered, even if just a little, was enough. He never claimed to be a savior. He never told them the full story. That was never Beatrix's way, and it wouldn't be his. But as the final town faded behind him and the sun dipped low in the sky, Oller felt something settle inside him. He wasn't lost anymore. He was living inside his own life again. The man he had been, the man he had become, and the man he was now. They were finally the same. That night, he and Boone camped beneath a canopy of stars. No walls, no secrets, no barriers between them. Oller leaned back against the truck. Boone curled beside him. the journal resting in his lap. "We made it," he said softly. Boone didn't move. He just let out a long breath. Somewhere in the quiet, Aller thought he could still hear her voice. Not in pain, not in apology, but in peace. And for the first time in a lifetime, Aller closed his eyes, not to forget, but to remember. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more real-life stories that touch the soul. Tap the bell so you never miss the next chapter of life.